Hello, everybody. This is the first in a series of videos just on taking your guaranteed and viable curriculum from beginning stages to actual fruition and implementation in the classroom. It's broken down into 6 steps, and this overview is the first part that's simply going to outline what those 6 steps are. This should not be anything really new. Most steps are things that we've been working on for years, but my hope is that in kind of putting all the pieces together in a clear way, it helps folks, number one, understand the rationale for why this is so imperative, and that it's not just a map collecting dust in a binder that you do on SIP days, or in Course Mason that you never look at, or something that doesn't actually guide your instruction, and instead see it as something that is a vital living part that helps everybody collectively do their job to get kids proficient in a set of standards, especially right now with COVID and being behind and knowing that we've got the equity gap and discrepancies from the first time ever that we've been out of school for an entire quarter. We're going to have to be even more cognizant of what's happening with our guaranteed and viable curriculum, or we're not going to help each other out in terms of feeding each other for the subsequent year. So this should be a fairly brief video, and then subsequently this week I'll be releasing the following steps. This is also what's going to take place at our curriculum development, and the deadline for all of this really is obviously by the beginning of next year to kind of have all of these pieces in place. Now, for some of you, these pieces are all finished. The only piece that's going to throw some folks for a loop are the learning progressions, which are kind of the linchpin piece with learning intentions that help things happen in the classroom, as opposed to, they are the linchpin piece that move it from a piece of paper, a map, to something that actually takes place in the classroom. So, and there's a little bit of work that's involved with that, with you and your team. So let's get started. First thing is, obviously, we're going to talk about a GVC, a guaranteed and viable curriculum. We need a defined curriculum, and this may seem elementary to a lot of you guys, but it is a specific set of standards, assessments, and instruction that are sequential and organized sequentially, so that you can't mix and change 4th unit with 1st unit, 3rd unit with 2nd unit. You can't just flip-flop them around, because they are supposed to build on one another, scaffold in such a way that they help students learn a required set of knowledge and skills over a specified period of time. It's not just about coverage of content and this linear thing. It's more like a staircase where it has to be increasingly more difficult in terms of the standards, the assessment, and the way that we're teaching. That being said, if we're clearly communicating this curriculum, students should be able to answer the questions that we've always been asking them, at least for the past 5 years. And that's, what am I learning? How am I doing? And what are my next steps? Or some version of that question. And we've gotten a lot better with that here in Roxana. I think, you can ask a lot of students what they're learning now, and they're able to state that. Where we tend to take a nosedive a little bit is in asking kids how they're doing and what their next steps are, because that really hinges heavily on the success criteria. And while we may have our learning intention, we have different interpretations of what a learning intention is. Some folks interpret that as a full-on big essential standard. Some folks interpret that as what I'm doing just for the day. And then some have criteria with it, some don't. And so this video obviously is an effort to continue to learn and grow through this process, so that we can become more and more clear with what this needs to look like for our kids to be able to answer those 3 questions. So where do we start? Obviously, we start with what Marzano pegs as a guaranteed and viable curriculum, what Danielson focuses on in domain one, and what Hattie focuses on as kind of your roadmap. And it answers that first question: what am I learning? It's what we want students to know and be able to do by the end of each course or by the end of each unit. It only refers to the essential standards that you are covering, not to everything that you teach. You teach a lot, but we need to ensure that kids are proficient, and we need to have evidence of that proficiency on those essential standards. And doing so really changes the way that the classroom looks if we're truly going to focus on ensuring that the kids walk out of your course proficient in those essential skills, which is going to make them successful in the next subsequent course. And it's got to be doable. And so that's going to bring us to kind of the map and where we're going to go through this. So here's kind of a step-by-step guide to creating and sustaining this GVC that take us from maps to actual instruction that's thoughtful, engaging, and increasingly rigorous. And if you start with a GVC, obviously the first thing you need to do is define what those essential HEART standards are. What do I need to know and be able to do by the end of the course? That moves into, or can be done simultaneously with, which is why you see both arrows coming off and going to step 1 and 2, creating essential questions and our big ideas. The essential HEART standards are the what, and the essential questions or big ideas are the why. And if you've missed that why piece, then kids are going to fall short on why this is relevant for me to be able to, why I have to know this, why I have to be able to do this. So they kind of they play in tandem. When you've created those, selected or created those, the next linchpin or bridge piece, which is why that step number 3 stands alone in the middle, is the bridge between the map and what's happening in the classroom, in a classroom in which kids can become self-assessors and can answer those final 2 questions. How are you doing and what are the next steps? So step 3 really is, what do I need to know and be able to do by the end of each day or each lesson, and what does that look like? And so that requires taking each essential HEART standard and developing some learning progressions with each one of those. And learning progressions are simply a series of scaffolded learning intentions that, when put together, get kids proficient in the overall essential larger standard. Step 4 then is, okay, I've got my learning intentions, I've got my learning progressions that are all lined up to my HEART standards. I need criteria. I need criteria for what it looks and sounds like to be successful in those learning intentions, and I need to communicate them in a way that students can answer that second question: how am I doing, or how will I know when I've learned it? I've seen a lot of classrooms that are putting up that statement now that say, how will I know when I've got it? Those are great. That's exactly what we're looking for. And those really are the bulleted items on a rubric. And then the 5th step really is, what are the themes or the topics that we have for our units of instruction? You still have to give some thoughts after you put all this together in terms of what our units of instruction are. And the reason that it's step 5 and not up closer is because I found this through my experience to be a stumbling block for a lot of folks. And that is, when you're trying to develop essential standards and learning progressions and essential questions, and you're doing that from your frame of reference of experience, you tend to start doing things like, well, I'm going to do this essential standard. Well, I normally teach that in unit 3. And when you start thinking about your units of instruction and breaking up those standards and those learning progressions, at the beginning part of the process, people get lost. It's too easy to get lost. So the way that we're going to go through each of these steps is to think about each of the standards and each of the learning progressions from start to finish without thinking about what units they go in. Just, how would I teach this skill? How would I teach this essential standard in this progression if that was the only thing I was hired to do? Once that's finished, then I can say, the first 2 steps of this standard are going to go in instruction, or in unit number 1. These next 2 standards are going to go, or learning intentions are going to go in unit number 5. It's easier to parse them out once you've linearly thought of, from beginning to end, what those progressions look like, which is why we're going to do that unit of instruction piece after we've pulled all of those other pieces together. And it's going to be heavily focused on themes or topics in which you can throw in or pull in more context and relevance to help kids understand it's not just about the thing you're teaching. It has far-reaching transferability. And then the last piece is that. The last piece is at the end of each unit, I need to pull all of the pieces together, all of the essentials to say, in unit number 1, it's this standard, it's this question, it's this learning intention, it's these criteria that fit here. And so you're going to have unit maps that kind of go through each piece of those. So that's generally the overview. But without the 3, it's really, and the 4, it's really hard to take the 5 and the 6 and implement it in a classroom where it makes sense and doesn't feel like it's just busy work. So step 1, essential heart standards. The way that we like to explain this is that they're the heart standards. You can't survive without your heart. It's the absolute things that kids need to know and be able to do by the end of the year, the semester, if you're in high school and it's a semester course, the end of the grade level, in order to be reasonably successful at the subsequent year. You can't cover and go deep on every standard that is technically on your plate because there's not enough time in the year. And you can't survive without a heart. So if you're not hitting the core pieces of what your curriculum is, then our students are set up for failure in the following year because they don't have the things that are going to make their heart continue to beat. The second piece of this is that you have along with the essential heart standards, you have supporting standards, which I'm considering kind of like the arms and the legs. It's great to have them. They do support you. They make your life easier. Those are the rest of the standards that you cover, but they're not necessary for you to be reasonably successful in the subsequent course. Now, you're going to have some kids that are going to have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a beating heart when they move on to the next course, because if you just mention a standard, they get it. But your job is to guarantee that every student in your class, whether the ones that have 2 arms and 2 legs or whether they're being rolled out of there with no arms, no legs, but they have to have a beating heart. And that number is typically somewhere between 8 and 15 standards per subject over the course of the year. If you truly, and you'll find this out when you go through your learning progressions, that when you really want to go deep and give kids a lot of opportunity to practice these, screw them up, and give feedback to each other and be self-assessing, it takes a lot longer than if you just handed them the knowledge or handed them the information. And so it's a little more complex than just running through and covering curriculum. This is not about coverage. This is about really having kids know and be able to be at least proficient in the heart standards. And so your target heart rate is 160. Why 160? Well, there's 180 days in a school year. Technically, by state, it's like 174 or something like that. When you think about assemblies, SIP days, fire drills, and the like, field trips, whatever, you really probably have at maximum 160 days in the year, or in other words, 160 class sessions per year. So it may be a 50-minute class session, it may be an 80-minute class session, it may be a 45-minute class session. But if that's all you have is 160 of those over the course of a year, and you'll find out in the learning progressions, we peg those to a number of days, they rack up very quickly. And it's going to be easy to see that if you truly want to go deep and build in time for kids to practice and make enough mistakes to learn those essentials, that you're going to be spending a lot of these beats per minute pretty quickly. But that's a way to think of it. You have 160 days, and if it's 160 days, you can't possibly get everything done that's on your map in terms of coverage or going deep. So the form that you're going to be provided with is this one. It's just there. Just list out your essential standards. Can this be done in Course Mason? Absolutely. We're not dictating where it's at, but what we want to make sure that gets reflected is that these essential heart standards are reflected on your syllabus, and that all of your grades are, whether you're standards based or not, are related back to how well kids perform on these specific standards. It's not about completion of tasks. And so that form will be provided to you and your teams as we go a little deeper. Obviously, there's a whole video on just the essential standards. Step 2, why do I need to know or be able to do this? This is the why part. These are the essential questions or the big ideas. And when we look at that, again, it provides the relevance for kids. These are not quick answers. These are open-ended. They stimulate thought, provoke kids to be engaged and interested. and they spark a lot more questions. These are absolutely not black and white. And they address why students need to know the content or why they should be interested in this particular thing. So they're usually more open-ended questions that start with how or why. And again, they're not closed response. They're open that are going to, it's going to take a full 6 weeks, 8 weeks, however long your unit is, to really think through and develop the skill set to be able to start providing some thought or some answers to those questions. Again, whole session on that. But it's so important for engagement and for relevance. If you don't think something's relevant, then you typically don't engage in it. And we know so many students that have an issue with engagement anyway. And sometimes that really falls down to we, the educators, not ensuring that we're trying to speak their language or make it relevant in some way that they're interested in. And so there's a form for that. Step 3. This is the big one. The first 2 videos are rather short. This one is going to take you through the process that we've done with several staff members already. So you get a feel for what it looks like. And then I'm going to explain in that video a specific process to be used. But here's the way we want to think about this. This is the whole Goldilocks principle. Learning progressions are nothing more than a series of learning intentions. Those are the things we're posting on the boards that we're pulling from an essential standard that create that scaffold and organization to ensure that we're doing things just right. It's not too hard and it's not too easy. It's that Goldilocks principle, or the zone of proximal development. We want to get them struggling just enough that it's challenging, but that they don't give up, and that they're motivated to continue more. And so that's what's up in the top box of this. With this thoughtful structure, students are willing to persevere, which we know they have a problem with, through struggle, because they regularly experience the reward for their efforts and are more likely to engage then in subsequent learning challenge. And the reason I put the pit on here is because that's what the pit is about. The learning challenge pit is about taking a concept, falling into the pit, struggling and making mistakes, because that's the fuel for learning. And if we're not getting kids time to screw things up and we're constantly rescuing them, then they're not able to pull themselves out of the pit, and they're always going to raise their hand and look at the teacher. And then there's no learning that's taking place. They have to struggle, but it's got to be just enough struggle. So if you look at each one of those pictures, the end of the pit is a little bit higher than the beginning of the pit. And if the end of that pit is a little bit higher, and that's where we start for the next learning challenge or the next learning intention in the progression, over time, they're going to continue, as you move left to right, get considerably higher, considerably more rigorous and complex in their learning as compared to just that first learning challenge alone. So if you want to think about it in a certain way, as time passes, duration, class periods, days or weeks, that's the x-axis along the bottom, the elevation needs to increase as well, which is the level of rigor that builds upon the next thing. That's how learning is supposed to be taking place, is that we're constantly very thoughtful about our progressions so that it's not just stuff. It actually is purposeful in building the next set of learning that ends up in something and ultimately transfer to a new context. Here's what we see sometimes, though. If they're not balanced and you have too much of the same content or too much of the same skill level, let's say we're just at the knowledge and application of DOK, it's going to feel pretty redundant to kids. They're going to feel like it's busy work, that it's sheer memorization and regurgitation of stuff. As you can see here, we just go on for days and weeks. We've got the same stuff and we're never increasing our rigor and it's never leading to anything. It just feels like stuff. The other extreme to this, if you're not balanced, is that there's too little time and too much of an increase. Man, we got to up our rigor, so let's go. We're going to really put the rigor on. If there's too quick of a jump in too short of a period of time, then they're just going to give up. I mean, it's no longer a pit. It's a chasm. It's a canyon that they're just going to look at and go, not doing it. Or instead of giving up, they'll be like, oh, Johnny's the smart one. He's figured it out. I'm going to go get what he's done, and then I'll turn that in. That's another thing to avoid. So we need to be balanced in how we do that. And the way that we're going to go about doing that really is taking this form or something like it that you want to create that puts the standard on there. And then there's a place for 15. What I've found happening is typically people don't have more than 5. So if I'm going to get them from the beginning of this standard to full fruition of my essential standard, that's going to take 5 separate learning intentions, and it's going to take a total of 10 days. And I'm going to walk them from DOK1 to DOK3 based upon what I'm thinking, done, and then you move on to the next one. Step 4. Once you get those progressions done, now, how are kids going to know they learned it? And we got to speak their language. And it's creating success criteria, creating rubrics that have little bulleted pieces that everyone is clear, absolutely. And if you want a paper pencil test, where do you pull how you're assessing their answers from? You pull it from the rubric that they've been working with that has those criteria listed. So if you got 4 success criteria listed on how to, what a good summary has to include in it, then your summary on a paper pencil test should be worth 4 points. And those 4 points are each allotted to each one of those success criteria on the rubric. Really, this is the linchpin piece that makes learning intentions worthwhile. Without success criteria, learning intentions aren't going to take you much of anywhere. With success criteria, the research is emphatic that this is a major difference maker in terms of kids becoming self-assessors and achievement going through the roof. This helps kids answer, how am I doing and what are my next steps? They usually should be written in student language, and they communicate what success looks and sounds like so that students can use them to self-assess and provide feedback to peers, which, again, if that's happening in class, that takes an inordinate amount of time. You're not going to have as much time to cover a lot of standards when you're engaging in this part of the process. So we're trying to really push towards these single column rubrics, and this is the form that you would be completing for each of your essential standards. You would list the essential standard on the first part. Step 2, you would list the learning intentions that you came up with underneath that first column. Then you jump to column 3 for proficient. What are the bullet points for what proficiency looks like for each one of those learning intentions? Then you jump to step 4 and you list how many fewer of those articulated criteria. So in columns 2 and 1, it's just going to say, if you've got 3 proficient criteria, column 2 is going to say 2 of the 3, column 1 is going to say 1 of the 3. If you've got 10 criteria for one of the rows under proficient, then you might say something like almost proficient is 7 to 9, and then it's 4 to 8 for the other one, something like that. Then when you're finished with those, and again, we're just trying to put all the meat in the green column in proficient 3, then you should go to step 5, which is developing the criteria for earning a score of 4. Now, I've got several options there, making for all of the criteria, plus you're doing some sort of transfer performance task with it. Those are difficult to come up with, not expecting people to do that right out of the chute, and some things really, honestly, don't easily lend themselves to that. Another way to do that would be to let them move ahead in the curriculum. Get a head start. Do the same task, but do it with a more complex text, which would be moving faster, but not necessarily deeper. That's a way to earn a 4. An easy one that you can put on all rubrics in the beginning is once you do all the bullet points, you meet all of those criteria in the green column. I simply say, all right, go teach it to so-and-so who's struggling with, and I observe you do that, I'm going to give you a 4. But there's, again, we're going to have a whole series on that particular piece. So that's step 4. Step 5 really are your units of instruction, where you start really now thinking about how you're going to parse them out. But one of the core things I want folks to think about is just in the naming of the unit, how you put kids on a different mental pathway. And we see a lot of okay namings of unit. This is our unit on Diary of Anne Frank. This is our unit on solving linear equations or the Civil War or living cells. Fine. What's better is to name these in broader concepts or broader themes so that I can pull in other things. So if I had a unit named Surviving Through Hope, sure, we can read the Diary of Anne Frank and use that as the anchor text, but we're also going to be able to pull in lots of other stories or articles or things that are current that are about surviving through hope, where we can compare characters and do lots more things than having it be just about Anne Frank. Same thing with solving linear equations. If solving linear equations is what you're really focused on, but the unit actually is about making arguments using data, then the whole focus becomes different. Like you can make lots of different arguments for which car to buy or which shampoo is the best or whatever, using the data from linear equations. So it becomes less about doing the math and more about doing the math to make a reasonable argument supported by data. Civil war, same thing, fighting for your core beliefs. Oh my gosh, how often does that happen nowadays where people are fighting for their core beliefs? So there's some relevant connection between what you're really doing. And it's not just about the Civil War. They're getting the context of the Civil War, the dates, the generals, everything they need historically in terms of content. You're not sacrificing that, but it's about something bigger. Same thing with living cells. What is life? More to come on that units of instruction. And then the last step really is, what do I need to know and be able to do proficiently by the end of each unit? That's where you're going to take all of these things and aggregate them together. So for a guaranteed viable curriculum in unit number 1, it's these particular unit are essential questions, these standards, these learning intentions, these success criteria. So you've got them all disaggregated out to specific units so that you know by the end of the year you've scaffolded everything very intentionally. And there's a form for that. So that's pretty much the overview, the steps. Look for the first video to come out. Again, we're going to go a lot deeper on curriculum development if you can show up to that. But the expectation, again, is by the beginning of next school year, now that we also have some free time in May, to really be thinking through what these look like and locking them down, that we'd be able to get this done. And the last, this isn't a step, but it's an example of a lesson plan. If I now have all of those pieces together, I've got my we are learning to, what our learning intention is. I know what progression that goes with. I know where the rigor's at. I've got a relevant essential question. I know the criteria we're working on today, and I know how I'm going to assess that. Here's my procedures and the time allotted. I even have a place for pedagogy. I'm going to think about matching. Look, if I'm really working on just the vocab part, I can use mnemonics at this particular piece and do a mnemonics game because it fits the level of learning. Or I want to do Socratic seminars because we're at DOK 3. I don't want to do something that's overly simplified. I want the rigor to match. And then you've got some places to check a box down at the bottom where we can be using the essential 6 or the significant 6 or anything that go along with what we know are good strategies regardless of what you're doing. Not that you have to use this form, but it gives you an option. So that's the overview. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to email me or call. Be happy to walk you through it. But again, we're going to go into a lot more depth for the subsequent 6 videos that hit each one of those steps independently.